Hello, friends, and welcome to session 9 of our Gut Logic book series. This is the Friendly Pharmacy 5 channel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lindsay Dixon. I'm a pharmacist from British Columbia, Canada, and we've been covering a lot of different topics about the microbiome and about gut health over the last few weeks. And the inspiration for this series came from this book, Gut Logic, which was written by Graham Mackenzie. I was also able to contribute to this book, and we're not trying to sell you this book on this during this series. What we are trying to do is give you evidence-based information about gut health and about the microbiome. And so if you're joining us today, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your involvement and your engagement in the comment section. If you are able to comment or ask a question as we go throughout today's session, you will be entered into a draw to win Graham Mackenzie's books. So Graham has written 2 books. One, like I said, is Gut Logic, and his first book is Healthy Logic, which is a really comprehensive resource on everything from vitamins to different treatments to compounding for topical formulations for pain and that kind of thing. So we will be announcing the winner of our draw for these books at the end of this session. And this is for hard copy or copied covers of these books. They're not ebooks. They'll be sent directly to you. Okay. So thank you so much for being here. We have a very special guest with us. Graham is here with us as well, and he'll be joining us more near the end of this session. Actually, before I introduce our speaker, I just have a quick little fun fact about the microbiome. So since today's topic is on the gut-brain axis, did you know that up to 95% of the total body serotonin is produced in the gut? And not only does the integrity of the gut microbiome influence the serotonin we make, but we now know that drugs like antidepressants that target serotonin can have a major effect on our microbiome. And so with that said, I would like to introduce you. Before I bring up our speaker, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about this incredible individual that is joining us today for the second time. And if you enjoy his lecture today, you should go back because he actually talked a few weeks ago as well on the microbiome and common infections. And that was just a phenomenal presentation. And so I encourage you to go back and check that out. So Dr. Paul Wischmeyer is our special guest today. Dr. Paul Wischmeyer is a tenured professor of anesthesiology and surgery at Duke University School of Medicine. He serves as Associate Vice Chair for Clinical Research and Director of the Nutrition Team at Duke Hospital, and he founded the Duke Clinical Nutrition Fellowship. Dr. Wischmeyer's work focuses on enhancing patient recovery from critical illness and surgery, with research interests in ICU nutrition, exercise rehabilitation, parenteral nutrition, and the microbiome. He has received substantial NIH and Department of Defense funding and numerous awards, including the Jeffrey Silverstein Award for Humanism in Medicine and the John M. Kinney Award for Nutrition Contributions. With over 210 publications and extensive speaking engagements, Dr. Wischmeyer is a leading advocate for patient-centered care and the importance of empathy in healthcare. Dr. Wischmeyer, thank you so much for taking some time out of your very busy schedule to be with us today again.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's so nice to have you. And we were speaking just before we came on that I actually was able to watch one of your lectures yesterday, and you kept me on a bit of a cliffhanger because I had to go. But I also found out that you do have your own YouTube channel. So for people who might be interested in watching some of your lectures, I understand that you're posting some of those up there. Where can people find your channel? Is it just under your name? I can't recall.
So yeah, it's at Paul_Wischmeyer MD.
Okay.
So it's basically my name. It's the same as my Instagram handle or name as well. So if you are following me on Instagram or just want to follow on YouTube, it's just at Paul_Wischmeyer MD. So hopefully easy to find. Just what you see right there actually is perfect. That's the same as my YouTube.
Yeah, I was thrilled to find out because now I can watch the rest of that lecture. And so I'll actually link your YouTube channel in the description of this video for people who are watching later as well. You guys can subscribe and watch Dr. Wischmeyer's lectures, and he's got lots of fascinating content on Instagram as well. So we'll link both of those in the description. Dr. Wischmeyer, I know you're tight on time today, so I'm not going to banter you with or pester you with a bunch of questions. But we really just want to hear from you and understand a little bit more about this topic of the gut-brain axis and what the evidence is for this. So you can free to take it from here.
Great. All right, let me get my slides up here and let's hit play. And Lindsay, you're seeing those okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So again, this is a lecture I really enjoy giving, and it really hopefully will help you begin to understand and even question what it is that not just makes us human, but makes up who we are as humans, our personality, uh, what makes us anxious, what makes us calm, what affects whether we're depressed or not, whether we feel things a certain way one day and a different way another day. And I think for many years, right, we've always just said, well, it's all in our head, or it's our brain that makes us who we are and feel this way, and our personality and our moods and all those things. But maybe that isn't entirely true. And maybe this has been known for many, many years. So, as some of you may know, the Egyptians, when they had entombed their pharaohs and their leaders in the pyramids, they would take their organs out and preserve them in jars. And they preserved many, many different organs. But there was one organ actually that they left out, interestingly, because they would preserve the organs that they thought were vital to their needs in the afterlife, and what would make them successful as whatever beings they were in the afterlife. But again, interestingly, they left one organ out, and that was the brain. They actually drained the brain out through the nose and didn't include it in the organs they thought were vital to who the person was. And interestingly, there's another organ that they did preserve that weighs the same amount as the brain, interestingly, it's the exact same weight, and may have just as much to do with who we are as humans as our brains do. What organ would that possibly be? It's the gut. And more importantly, it isn't so much the intestines themselves that somehow affect who we are and how we think and whether we're depressed or not. It's our gut microbiota. It's our gut microbiome that defines, I will show you in many ways, who we are, how we feel, and how we act, which I think, as I've learned more about it, is a shock, and I'm guessing will come to many of you as a shock, because the reality is, I think in medicine, there's of course, I'm an ICU physician, and so I spend a lot of time thinking about eliminating bacteria. But as it turns out, these bacteria that live in our gut do many important things for us, including making up who we are as humans, both physically and our personalities. And so the reality is, these bacteria are 100 trillion friends. Most of us probably didn't know we had, and that we want to keep around, and that their makeup affects who we are and how we act. And so, as you heard me talk about last time, and I think is incredibly important to say, is that the day is coming where instead of treating depression with serotonin drugs or antidepressants, or treating psychological and physical diseases with antibiotics or things like that, instead, we'll be using our own poop, perhaps, and there's books about that. If you want to start storing your poop, that actually might be helpful. If you're going to have a bone marrow transplant, you should probably definitely be storing your poop. There's studies going on where they're giving back people's healthy stool after they've had that. But we'll be writing prescriptions for probiotics and for stool pills, perhaps. And the kids at MIT actually will tell you that if you take stool pills that they have made from their own stool, it'll make you smarter. Now, the FDA has qualms with that, of course. But nonetheless, the things that make up our microbial cells not only will affect our physical health, but seem to have a huge effect on our psychological health and our brains. And so again, most people wonder, why should I care about my microbes? And I think for the many reasons we're going to talk about in the brain, they do even more fundamental things than that. And I think for those of you who didn't hear my last lecture, I think it's key to realize how much of your life are actually affected by your microbes. Because have you ever wondered why when you go out in the woods, you get bitten by all the mosquitoes and your husband or wife or the person you're with doesn't? Well, it's not because you're sweeter. It's because the microbes that live on your skin actually attract or repel mosquitoes. And so it's actually your bacteria that decide whether you get eaten by the mosquitoes or not. And even more perhaps shocking is the microbiome, or the bacteria that live in our intestines, may ultimately decide who we have sex with and marry someday. Shocking perhaps, but we know for sure that if you're a fruit fly, this is true. Fruit fly mating behavior is definitely driven by the microbiome bacterial makeups of their guts. So the mates they choose are driven by the bacterial makeup of their intestines and their guts. And someday we might find out this is true for humans as well. So again, that would be fairly shocking, but this seems to be true in other animals, maybe true in us as well. So how do they do all that? And again, to get to some of the basics that I think are important to understand, I think it's important to ask, what is it that makes us human? And for many people, I think we think our cells perhaps make us human. Well, all of you sitting out there listening today have 30 trillion human cells in your body, but you have 38 trillion microbial cells in your body. So cellularly, you're actually more than 50% microbial, not human. And many people think maybe it's our genes that make up who we are. Well, you have about 20,000 human genes that define your characteristics. But right now, all of you sitting in your bodies, sitting at home, have 20 million microbial genes. So genetically, you're 1% human and 99% microbial. And of course, these bacteria that live in our gut not only affect things that happen in our gut or things that happen to us physically, but they have profound effects on our brain. And there's a great deal of communication that not only goes from the gut to the brain, but from the brain to the gut. And we're going to talk about that, how stress and anxiety and lack of sleep and all these different things that happen and affect mental stress in our minds change the bacteria that live in our guts that ultimately change us physically in pretty dramatic ways. And so the gut manipulates your mind, but I will also show you your mind manipulates your gut and affects the bacteria, which seems shocking that your brain could change the bacterial makeup of your body, but it does. And so again, this is far more than an emerging concept. This is something that, again, you just heard about another key book that was written by Gut Logic, but there are numerous books, the Mind-Gut Connection. There are innumerable publications on this now. This is all over the internet. When I do hashtags on Instagram for gut brain or other gut brain related hashtags, there's innumerable posts about this, right? This is really a huge area now that people are very aware of. And they interact very closely. And there's a lot of people that think that, again, if you control your mind, you'll control your body. And that's something our mothers may have told us, or our grandmothers, but they're really true. And you're going to see pathways like this throughout this lecture a lot, that there is this very direct connection through the vagus nerve and through things that our bacteria in our gut release that interact with the brain, and then the brain interacts with the gut. And again, these are some of the pathways. This is the first of a number of times you're going to see figures that describe this relationship between the brain and the gut. And there's a lot of really exciting publications coming out, and there's more coming out every day. But again, there's a huge body of research. And in fact, our laboratory is spending a lot of time on this, on the role of the Alzheimer's disease and cognition and the microbiome, and how we might be able to reverse cognitive impairment as people age or from surgery by changing the microbiome and looking at changes in the microbiome and things like Alzheimer's. And again, anxiety and depression right now, there's a lot of treatment trials where probiotics and looking at the microbiome and anxiety and depression, and I'll talk about some of those. Autism has a clear link to the gut and to the gut microbiome, and we'll talk about that. Even schizophrenia and other sorts of psychologic illnesses that we thought was all sort of brain driven may or may not, actually, that may not be true. And so let's just start with autism, right? Which is unfortunately one of the most commonly diagnosed disorders in kids. I think we've gotten better at diagnosing it, and there's a whole spectrum of different kinds of autism now. Well, one of the key associated symptoms of autism, in addition to the other things, is a huge number of kids with autism have a lot of GI distress. Almost 90% of patients, in fact, will have GI symptoms as part of their autism. And so there's a lot of connection that's being found in the literature that people with autism have changes in their microbiome that can be detected in many different levels, and that treatment with different probiotic and other microbiome of influencing treatments can change some of the behaviors and some of the challenges that autistic children and adults face. And so again, there is a clear link that's been shown between the severity of GI dysbiosis, which dysbiosis means a deranged bacterial makeup. When you lose the healthy bacteria and you have unhealthy or pathogen bacteria growing in your gut, that is associated with the severity of autism. And that is something we believe we can intervene on. If you look at publications, this is only up to 2015, there's many more since then, but there's, of course, an enormous number that are blowing up on the microbiome itself. But in other cognitive and neurologically related diseases, MS, autism, epilepsy, stroke, there's a huge growing number of publications, and Alzheimer's and cognition is a huge one, along with autism, that's really growing. And we'll talk about some of the data and literature for that. So I think it's really important to realize too, that one of the reasons I think some of these different neurologic and cognitive challenges seem to be growing so rapidly in our population is we in the US and in the Western world don't have what we have evolved as humans to be a normal microbiome. We don't have normal microbiomes because of our diet, because of our exposure to antibiotics. If we were to look at tribes from places in Africa and South America that have never seen Western food and never seen Western medicine, they have a infinitely more diverse microbiome. You can see the human microbiome project there, and those orange dots is very different from the stool makeup of subjects that have never seen Western medicine or Western food. And so we already have set ourselves into a different direction and path for the evolution of cognition disorders, autism, inflammatory diseases, and autoimmune diseases, because we already have changed our microbiome so dramatically, even people we think to be healthy. And so going back real quick, antibiotics, of course, have been a major advance in the care of people and in patients. But as we've begun to eliminate incidence of infectious diseases by using antibiotics, we have exponentially increased the occurrence of autoimmune diseases, because we're disturbing the very basic makeup of the bacteria that interact with our immune system and prevent us from having our immune system attack ourselves. And that's what leads to a lot of this autoimmunity, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, the illness I had as a child. All these have been shown to have really very close relationships to the eradication of and change of the microbiome from antibiotics, Western medicine, and Western diets. And so I think this is critical to realize. When we change one thing, we may help things, but when we change those things, we also cause challenges. And so again, where do our microbes come from? I think if you have a dog at home, you should know you have a different microbiome than those of you who don't have dogs at home. But fundamentally, our microbes come from our moms. And for of course, many, many years in our development as humans, we all were born by vaginal delivery. And thus our skin, our gut, our mouth, the microbiome of all those areas in a child for about the first 3 years of life resembles mom's vaginal flora. And that's how we as humans were developed or evolved to create immune tolerance and to have our body's immune system develop correctly. But then, of course, in recent years, many children are being born by C-section. And when you're born by C-section, your microbiome in your gut and your mouth and your skin resembles mom's skin, which is very different than mom's vaginal flora and bacterial makeup. And we know that C-section kids have more cases of obesity, autoimmune disease, asthma, and other even perhaps neurologic and psychologic challenges. And so I will tell you that one of the most famous microbiome scientists out there, when his first child was born, and that child was born by C-section, he kicked everyone out of the delivery room and he smeared his wife's vaginal secretions all over the baby. And I would encourage all of you out there, if you have children soon by C-section, do the same thing. You likely will be doing your children a big favor. And that's probably the only thing you'll remember from this lecture, but hopefully your children will thank me for it someday. And so that's why it's so critical to realize we're supposed to evolve with vaginal flora rather than mom's skin flora. And we know that not only the way we're born and the exposure we have at birth makes up potentially the future occurrence of obesity and of neurologic and psychological diseases and autoimmune diseases, but early childhood exposure to antibiotics. So receiving antibiotics when you're less than 5, especially, also leads to a whole host of things like obesity and other autoimmune diseases, asthma and allergies and all the like. And so clearly us deranging our microbiome when we're young, whether it be by C-section or with exposure to antibiotics, changes who we are as humans. And so again, the microbiome science has evolved a long way. And so in fact, we have such good science that we can actually tell with 90% accuracy if someone's obese or not, just by looking at the microbial makeup of their guts. Well, you might say that's not very exciting. We can tell by looking at people if they're obese. Well, we often think that people feel like they're obese because of their genetics. And again, the reality is you can only tell with 60% accuracy if someone's obese by their genetics. whereas you can tell 90% accuracy about their microbiome. So the data would say that your microbiome is actually probably much more important than your genetics to whether you're obese or not. Now, many of you may not believe that. Are there experiments that actually show that? And there actually are. There's a lot of exciting research going on both in the brain and in the body that look at taking stool from one animal and giving it to another animal that doesn't have any bacteria. It's born in a sterile area like this with no bacteria. So they're called germ-free mice or notobotic mice, and they're born without bacteria, and they're kept in these sterile areas. And then they do experiments. For instance, they take the stool from an obese mouse and they give it to these animals that don't have any bacteria in their guts. And when you take the stool from an obese mouse and you give it to a notobotic or germ-free mouse, the mouse becomes obese. And I'm going to show you it's not just the metabolism that changes, they eat more. And if you take the stool from a thin mouse and you give it to a germ-free mouse when they're little, they stay thin. What about human disease? Can you recapitulate that? So if you take the stool from an obese human and give it to a germ-free mouse, they become obese. So you can actually recreate human disease in animals just by transferring the bacteria in our stool, in our poop, from the human to the animal. And that changes who they are fundamentally. And so even starvation and malnutrition can be transferred. They've done twin studies where they have one twin who is not malnourished, and these are done in African camps that provide food to starving children. And they'll take another twin who actually, unfortunately, is starved. And they will take the stool from the malnourished child, and the mice become malnourished. So the bacteria in your gut determine even not just if you're obese, but your ability to use nutrients appropriately. And again, about 70% of our amino acids actually could be generated by the intestinal flora that live in our guts. And so they play a huge role in vitamins and amino acids and all the other things. They can generate all those things, and they're really important to us. And that brings up the very question, right? What's driving the obesity epidemic? Right now in the world, there are more obese people than there are non-obese people the first time ever. And that's definitely true in the US. And a lot of people have thought, well, it's diet, or it's changing in Western medicine, or it's people's habits. And in fact, of course, 2/3 of Americans are obese. But the reality is that's probably not the whole story, or even most of the story. And so to get at that question and to help you think about it and help us think about it, do differences in the microbiome matter? We'll ask a fat mouse. Mice who are obese have very different looking microbiomes than mice who are not obese. And in fact, if you take different kinds of mice and you look at their microbiome contents, you'll see there's dramatic differences between obese mice and non-obese mice. And that's how they do those transfers. But the interesting thing is, it doesn't just change how they metabolize sugar or how they make fat or how they burn fat. It actually changes how they eat and how much they eat. Mice who have a predisposition you can transfer the traits, and they actually eat more. And so your brain may be saying, I know I need to eat a salad, or I know I need to eat less, but your gut will make it nearly impossible for you to do that and make it much more difficult to lose weight or to change your diet. And in fact, the body will defend a weight that it's been at for a long time really aggressively. And we're finding that perhaps the day is coming where we're going to take stool transplants or fecal transplants from thin people and give them to obese people. And that kind of research is going on right now. There's studies going on where they're taking twins, one thin twin and an obese twin, and doing a fecal transplant from the thin twin to the obese twin. Because again, this may fundamentally change not only how we metabolize nutrients and how we metabolize fat, but how much we eat and what our brains make us or convince us to do. And so there's a lot of exciting ways we're using in science to investigate the role of the microbiota, the gut-brain axis. And these include these germ-free mice studies, probiotic studies where different kinds of bacteria are given to try to affect the brain, antibiotic studies where you wipe out the flora of the gut, and then fecal transplant studies like we talked about. So there's a lot of exciting things. And so they've actually looked at the sort of neurologic, cognitive, and psychologic makeup of these mice who have no bacteria. Because actually, of course, we as humans need to have bacteria in our guts. And so they've looked at how do these mice behave and how are they different? And so it looks like germ-free mice have a number of significant alterations, including decreased memory. They have increased brain serotonin. We talked about serotonin before. And they have altered social behaviors. So if you don't have bacteria in your gut or you lose your normal bacteria, it changes lots of things from memory to serotonin, which helps prevent depression and changes how we feel, to how we interact with each other. And again, there's a lot of things, and we'll get at these things, that are released from the bacteria in our gut that signal our brain through the vagus nerve and other areas. It changes our cortisol and our stress hormones, huge effects on these things. And so again, lots of studies showing that there's all kinds of changes in anxiety and socialization and behavior if you take away bacteria. And that could be just with antibiotics. So when you take antibiotics, it is almost assuredly likely it's going to change your behavior and who you are a bit for a while, maybe for a long time, because not everyone recovers a normal microbiome after they take antibiotics. And so this has been looked at really extensively, and I won't spend a lot of time on the science, but this is the responses of germ-free mice and specific changes of taking away the pathogens, keeping a healthy microbiome in mice on stress. So they restrain mice, then look at the release of stress hormones like steroids, corticosterone, which is a stress steroid. You release it when you're very stressed, either cognitively or physically. And there's big differences in the release of stress hormones based on the bacterial makeup of your gut. And so I think this is very interesting. And you can actually give back the bacteria from other animals' guts to the germ-free mice, and that changes their response to stress as well. And so again, I think one of the key things is our diet, and I can't put enough emphasis on this. People with non-Western diets who eat more fiber, more fermented foods, things like kefir and yogurt and other things like that, have a much higher concentration of the healthy bacteria. That leads to a much greater production of the key short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids are the fuel that our gut and a lot of our body uses for its cells. And that clearly seems to improve mood disorders. There's some great research out there on this. Whereas a Western diet leads to dysbiosis and the loss of normal bacteria. You lose short-chain fatty acids, and these individuals, when this has been studied, clearly have increased anxiety and increased depression. And so clearly our diet is changing the incidence of depression and anxiety that we're seeing. And there's ways we hope that we can learn to treat that, both by improving diet, but also by replacing lost bacterial families. And so what happens to the gut-brain axis in stress, right? And clearly in this modern world we live in, we have enormous amounts of stress. We have traffic, we have bills, we have our kids and our childcare and interest rates that are through the roof. And of course, we have this kind of stressor that is in the news every day. And depending on your political views, both sides of the aisle would say that he probably creates stress for you in one way or another. So all these stressors are things that will change our bacteria in our guts and change how our brain and our guts and our bacteria survive or don't survive. And this is so true, right? This is a statement from many years ago, but it's not the stress that kills us, right? It's the reaction to it. It's your body's reaction to it, right? There's probably people or maybe you're one of those people yourselves that people always say you're so resilient, nothing seems to bother you. You seem to be able to be highly performing through even those stressful situations. Well, that may go back in a lot of ways to your gut or how your brain affects your gut when you are stressed. And so again, in a healthy situation, right, the bacteria in our guts are normal, and they communicate normally with our brains, and they maintain a normal sort of healthy brain function. In stress and disease, the stress that your brain senses changes your intestines. That's why people always say, I get stomach aches or diarrhea or constipation when I'm stressed. Well, they're not making that up. Some people say, oh, you're just making that up. You're just, somaticizing, but they're not. Stress changes the bacterial makeup of your gut very quickly. And it changes the metabolites in your gut very quickly. So these people really do suffer GI distress because their brain is changing the bacteria in their guts. And so again, this is a bidirectional communication. So some of these studies are really interesting. Like if you take a mouse away from its mother, its intestinal flora changes almost immediately. And if you sleep deprive someone, that increases cortisol, which creates all kinds of pathogen overgrowth in your gut. So even just sleep deprivation changes cortisol, it changes your intestines. And overgrowth of gut pathogens changes the immune system, and it causes you to release cortisol and inflammatory cytokines. And so again, stress changes your bacteria, and then your bacteria change your body. Not for the best always, right? And that's one of the ways we know our brain affects our gut. And this is a really neat video that shows us how the brain and the gut talks to the brain. So the gut's microbiome releases serotonin and CCK and affects cytokines and short-chain fatty acids, GABA, which is a vital signal in our brain. And all these stresses significantly change what the brain does. And the brain talks back. And I'll let you watch this video one more time. So again, the bacteria in your gut, if they change and like take antibiotics, that's going to change what your brain sees. It's going to change your serotonin levels. It's going to change how your brain communicates with the rest of the body. And then the stress the brain potentially sees signals the gut through the vagus nerve and through other signaling mechanisms and changes your microbiome. And so there's this circular communication. I think this is a brilliant explanation of how this works. And so it's really critical to realize that stress and pain and all these things have significant changes. And that's why we have to say things like IBD and IBS seem to be stress-related diseases. And people always thought, well, that sounds a little hokey-pokey or homeopathic. That is definitely the case. And we can now prove it scientifically that when your brain is stressed, or if you have consistent stress, you're much more likely to have changes in your microbiome that can lead to IBD and IBS and changes of inflammatory diseases in your gut. And so again, now we can put science and understanding to this. And so this is not particularly new data either. So this is a paper from 1974 that shows that if you take this control mice who aren't stressed, they have a really high concentration of the lactobacilli that we think is very healthy. Lactobacilli is one of the most common probiotics we use. It's been shown to treat a lot of different kinds of illnesses successfully. But stressed mice rapidly lose lactobacilli, and this is long before microbiome science was ever a possibility. This was just them culturing lactobacillus. And so we've known for, gosh, almost my whole life, more than 50 years, that stress depletes the healthy bacteria that are so important to we being healthy humans. And again, social stressors also change the healthy bacteria that live in our gut, not just lactobacillus. So these different families that probably are ones you've never heard of, Caprococcus and Doria, these are all commensal organisms. And again, when stress leads to the loss of abundance of commensal organisms, inflammatory cytokines go up. So if you have a derangement of your gut microbiome, and that could be from stress, that could be from antibiotics, the inflammatory makeup, these inflammatory mediators that potentially can cause injury to not just bacteria, but to your good tissues as well, through autoimmune diseases, go up. And so again, stress causes us to lose commensal organisms, and that changes our immune response. That's why people say they get sick when they're stressed out. So lots of things affect our gut. We know that even opiates, taking pain medicine like the different pain pills, oxycodone, hydrocodone, that signals your bacteria in your gut that something's wrong. They sense opiates because we make natural opiates ourselves, and the bacteria sense that. So the Pseudomonas, the pathogens that live in all of our intestine, and there's Pseudomonas in all your guts right now that are sitting quiescently waiting for you to get stressed. They then, when they sense opiates, or they sense low phosphorus levels, or they sense psychological stress, they talk to each other and say, my host is in trouble and they're weak. Let's attack. And that's quorum signaling. That's how bacteria talk to each other. John already discovered that. And they know when we're stressed, and they sense that through our endogenous opiates. When you take opiates, the body senses that bacteria get more aggressive. And that's true from a lot of other things as well. So again, we looked at this in the ICU, and I won't spend much time on this, but I think it's important to realize just what the stress of critical illness does, because it's not just a physical stress. And we were able to look at what happens when people become critically ill. And we looked at quite a few patients, all on a ventilator, and unfortunately all got antibiotics. And of course, what we wanted to see was what happens to the healthy microbiome that all of us should have each day. And of course, we know a healthy gut is a diverse gut with lots of different bacteria that do all the important things. And what we discovered was when you get sick, you lose those healthy bacteria very rapidly, and your stool, your mouth, and your skin begin to look the same. And so you lose diversity, you lose this benefit. So the two top tables there show admission and discharge ICU patients. All that red is pathogens. And you can see the healthy people down in that lower graph there. They are mostly green and blue. That's healthy bacteria. So when you become very sick, you rapidly have pathogens grow up. And so illness, the Western diet, psychological stress, all lead to loss of diversity. So the brain or the body can change the gut. And this is associated with illness, adverse outcomes. And so we need to be correcting this. And so the question then becomes, can we change the microbiome to cure disease? Can we actually prescribe poop or write for probiotics and change things? And should we be giving back bacteria, resodding the lawn when people are stressed or when people undergo illness with probiotics and stool pills and the like? And can we specifically change cognitive, neurologic, and brain-related disorders? Like last time we talked about how we can change infections, and you can reduce infections significantly by taking probiotics. Can you change your mood and your depression and the other sorts of psychological things that happen with stress with microbiome interventions. So one of the things we know already is diet changes this, right? Diet is critical. And so we know, just starting out with patients in the hospital, after heart surgery, if you're malnourished, you're much more likely to be delirious and have cognitive dysfunction after surgery. We have a large trial going on right now with major cardiac surgery patients where we've collected hundreds, more than 300 microbiome samples from many, many patients before surgery, after cardiac surgery, and then we do very intricate cognition studies out to a year. And we're going to look at the effects of different microbiome changes on what happens, because we know people that undergo cardiac surgery, many of them have significant cognitive defects that occur. And we're trying to decide, are those actually driven by changes in the microbiome, either that occurred before they had surgery or that are occurring after they had surgery? So we know that nutrition is also one of these big drivers. So good nutritional state is fundamental. But the gut-brain axis is much more than just nutrition, right? And vagus nerve is the key nerve that connects your gut to your brain. And what we say is what happens in vagus not only stays there, but has it in the gut, in the body, it doesn't just stay there, and it has a huge effect on your emotions. And so what happens in vagus affects your emotions. It doesn't just stay in your intestines. And so there's lots of data to show that gut pathology is linked with brain pathology. And so anxiety and depressive disorders clearly are linked with dysfunction in the intestine. So for instance, irritable bowel syndrome is also commonly associated with anxiety and depression. And I think some people just thought that people who are anxious somaticized more, complained more about their intestines. Well, that's not true. The intestine microbiome makeup of people with IBS and anxiety is different than people who aren't anxious. So it's not all in your head. It's also clearly affecting your gut. Schizophrenia is linked with celiac disease. Autism, as we've said, is linked with lots of GI microbiome disorders. Probiotics can affect this. Again, even germ-free mice have a lot of changes that can be associated with similar things we see in schizophrenic patients. So not having a normal microbiome is bad for potentially your risk of developing psychological diseases. There was interesting studies that have happened when water supplies in cities have been contaminated with particular pathogenic bacteria. So what they found was, in this particular town, was in Walkerton was the town, that the people weren't actually sick, but they were getting subclinical or sub-infectious amounts of a campylobacter. And it led to significant increases in anxiety in the whole town. So anxiety can be produced by subclinical or infections you don't know that you have, leading to changes in your gut microbiome that you won't even feel that are occurring. And this was a really neat study, I think, that showed how anxiety is driven by the bacteria that live in our guts. And what about the role of antibiotics and ICU cognition and psychological outcomes? So we know that antibiotic exposure, change in the microbiome in people who are sick, leads to a lot of psychiatric effects. This is a really neat study in molecular psychology, psychiatry. It leads to anxiety, panic disorders, depression, psychosis, delirium. This is a rapidly growing body of literature that a lot of the things that we sort of think are just all in our heads really are mostly in our guts. And so this was a really neat study, antibiotic exposure and the risk for depression or anxiety. 212,000 depressed and anxious patients matched with 860,000 controls. This is a massive, over 1 million patient population study. And a single antibiotic course in patients was significantly associated with a high depression risk for all different antibiotic groups, right? And even the most common and basic things we give to people in the outpatient setting every day. So penicillins, so the augmentin, the ampicillin that people take, that our kids take frequently, that we take frequently, lead to more depression. The quinolones, so things like Cipro and Levaquin, significant increases in depressions, depressive episodes. And this occurs much more frequently the more times you take antibiotics. So if you take penicillin multiple times, you're markedly increasing your odds ratio or your risk of getting depression, which is probably something that no one's ever said to you, or no one's ever said to many of us, but this is truly the case. And so I think this is really important. Anxiety risk also increased with single and multiple exposures to antibiotics. So there's lots of reasons, right? We always encourage you to limit antibiotic exposure to yourselves and to your kids, because we tell you might get, resistant antibiotics or resistant bacteria to antibiotics, but you also may be driving depression and anxiety and mood changes in yourselves and in your family. And this is really interesting data. And so there was a 50% increase in depression risk if you took multiple courses of a penicillin-containing antibiotic. And if I had a hunch, I would say antibiotics that kill anaerobes, things like Flagyl and Cipro, probably are just as offensive and maybe more offensive. It's just not so many people take those. Penicillins are much more common. And so again, in the ICU or hospital setting, for those of you that work in hospitals, things like Zosyn that wipe out everything. There was just a paper that came out last week, in fact, that showed that patients who had Zosyn versus cefepime, for those who not work in hospitals, doesn't affect anaerobes and Zosyn does, had a higher risk of death in a large population study where they looked at shortages of Zosyn and what happened to patients versus when they didn't. It was a great natural experiment. And so antibiotics that wipe out anaerobes and penicillin-containing antibiotics seem to have a lot of effects, not just on depression, but even on survival, perhaps. And in fact, ICU patients, and of course I work in the ICU, so I like to talk about what happens after people are sick, that many patients after illness suffer depression. And I just showed you data that every patient who's on a ventilator in the ICU in North America or any other Western country gets antibiotics. And it's just got some relation, not just the fact they were sick, but related to antibiotic use. And so again, this has been looked at in PTSD patients. So again, PTSD is common after illness or stress, and there is a significant loss of diversity and of healthy bacteria in individuals with PTSD. And so could we treat PTSD perhaps by giving back, either by fecal transplants or by probiotics, and make their condition better through treating the gut? And so again, that's the question I want to get to next, right? I led that to say, are there data to show this? And so I think to maybe take this further, how are we going to affect depression and how are we going to affect what happens? And that's the idea of the things that our probiotics do are also psychobiotics, and they have significant effects on the brain and significant effects on changing what our brain sees. And this is a great review article if you want to learn more about psychobiotics and the idea that probiotics also affect the brain. But again, as you heard us talk about through the lecture, the microbiota release all kinds of neurotransmitters from our gut that see our brain, transmit through the vagus system, get there through the blood and spinal pathways. The gut is like a whole nother brain in our body, is the best way to put it. So they generate a lot of bacterial neurotransmitters. This is a great slide that really shows all the things they do. And that's why we call them psychobiotics. So prebiotics and fiber can change a lot of these mediators because that's what bacteria metabolize to make them. And probiotics also change them as well and signal to the vagus nerve. And so stress affects this, gut permeability affects this, and this is how stress and our brain communicate. So I told you to see a lot of figures showing the vagus nerve and these different mediators. And again, our diet does this as well. So it's not just stress, but let's combine the stress we all live with every day with traffic and all the other stresses in our life with the fact that many people don't eat a diverse diet that is a non-Western diet or a healthy diet, and that adds to the problem. And so what about giving back some of these probiotics or healthy bacteria? So they did studies in healthy women by giving fermented milk, which is like yogurt or kefir, and they looked at different signaling processes in the brain with scans and other measures of anxiety. And they found that there were beneficial effects on anxiety, depression, and changed cortisol. So just by taking fermented products like yogurt or other probiotic containing foods, you can change emotion and depression and anxiety, the data would say. And in fact, they've done a lot of neat functional MRI studies that show that individuals who take fermented products like probiotics and other probiotic containing foods have a big change in their emotional attention tasks when measured by brain functional MRI. You could see there's a significant decrease in some of the signaling things that lead to the negative sort of sequelae that our brain sees, even when we do this very sensitive sorts of imaging. In mice, it's true as well. Probiotics can significantly reduce anxiety and behavioral despair. So they put mice in different settings and they look how active the mice are. And they look at the body temperature and they look at cortisol release. And they found that giving probiotics can make mice less depressed, I guess is the way to put it. They're more active. They're much more sort of engaged in the world. And it reduces stress, corticosterone, which again is a stress hormone. And so again, probiotics are interesting to study to see if it's actually the probiotic or something else doing it, because if you clip the vagus nerve, if you cut the vagus nerve, you take away a lot of the effects the gut can have on the brain. And what we found is when you take the vagus nerve away in a lot of these studies, you lose the beneficial effects on depression and anxiety in a lot of these animal studies that you get by giving probiotics or changing the gut. So we can really say that the gut is signaling the brain, and we can take that away if we take away the vagus nerve. And so that's one of the ways of proving that these things are acting through the gut. And in fact, this has even begun to be shown in humans. So this is looking at a score we do in a lot of our patients called the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale. It's a very common scale we use in patients. And they looked at patients who got a probiotic versus those that didn't. And as you can see down here in this data, there was a significant benefit to the patients on the probiotic in the changes in their scores. They had much lower scores on follow-up. So the initial was baseline. That's what the BL stands for. And the follow-up, the HAD scores are depression and anxiety scores. And the patients had much bigger changes in the percentage change in the reduction of their hospital, post-hospital anxiety and depression when they got a probiotic. And that was true for a lot of the different scores, both in change and in actual total score. And so we can change the post-stress and illness hospital anxiety scores using probiotics. And of course, depression has a lot more data than a lot of these other areas. There's whole meta-analyses now that show that probiotics can positively affect anxiety and depression in multiple reviews and multiple trials. And so this data is getting much stronger and much more widespread. And so I think the day is coming where this could be a primary treatment for depression and anxiety. And how does it work? Again, we've talked about this. It has a lot of beneficial effects, probiotics could. And specific probiotics have actually been looked at mechanistically as a great review in Nature Reviews. So specific bacterial probiotics like B. longum, which is a common strain that's used in probiotics, changes the vagus nerve signaling and brain BNF pathways. LGG, Lactobacillus rhamnosus, which is a common probiotic that's one I take at home and my kids take, changes GABA upregulation in the brain. Maybe that's why I'm pretty happy and positive. I don't know. But other probiotics do the same. They change serotonin metabolism. They change MAO, which is one of the main drugs we use. And so probiotics have a lot of effects that actually can be measured in humans and in animals on these key mediators. Tryptophan metabolism is another key mediator that actually can do good and bad things. And the way we use and metabolize tryptophan is entirely regulated by our intestinal microbiome makeup. So if our intestinal microbiome has got healthy bacteria like the Clostridium that's described here in this first figure, actually it leads to the generation of neuroprotective kinds of metabolites. And so bacteria metabolize even single amino acids differently based on what bacteria is present in the gut. Lactobacilli do the same thing. Lactobacilli can metabolize tryptophan to maintain a better immune system response in our intestine. However, tryptophanase expressing bacteria, which can be some of the pathogens, can lead to negative effects of the metabolism of tryptophan and can lead to kidney disease and oxidative stress and vascular disease. And so again, the same nutrient can be metabolized very differently for the better or for the worse based on the bacteria that live in our intestines. And I think that's really interesting. And this has been studied in MS as well. So propionic acid is one of the short-chain fatty acids that is generated by a healthy gut microbiome when it metabolizes fiber or prebiotics. And so when they looked at propionic acid in multiple sclerosis patients, there was significant reductions in stool and serum in patients with MS. And then Treg cells, which are really critical autoimmune diseases and the progression of MS, were lowered and really were not ideal in their numbers. By giving back propionic acid, there's lots of benefits potentially that can occur, and it changed the Treg cell expression in the gut. It changed Treg cell numbers and metabolism, and it reduced relapse rate and disease progression. And so by giving back the specific metabolites that are generated by our microbiome in the gut, butyric acid, propionic acid, things like that, we can actually change things like MS and other diseases. And so this is perhaps what you might call a postbiotic. It's a metabolic byproduct or the metabolic endpoint of what bacteria make. And exercise, we always say exercise can improve mood, and actually that signals the gut as well. And exercise actually maintains a healthy gut microbiome and leads to the generation of propionic acid, like we just talked about, which is beneficial in MS, butyrate and acetate, and the neurotransmitters. So we think exercise makes us feel better because it's good for our bodies, and we always say it's good for the mind. Well, it actually is good for the mind in many ways because it's good for the gut. And it actually changes the gut generation of many of the neurotransmitters. And so exercise probably does good things for the gut, but then do good things for the mind, which is something that not many people ever think about when they're exercising. And so in conclusion, I hope I've impressed upon you what a critical world the microbiome is to how we as humans not only function physically, but cognitively. And we can change our world for better or for worse by the foods we eat, the probiotics we take, the antibiotics we take, and how we care for our microbiome. And again, the microbiome gut axis is growing rapidly, and it affects pain and depression and autism. We've heard us talk about obesity and cardiovascular risk. All of these things are affected by our gut microbiome and how it affects our brain. And so we're doing lots of studies, and our lab is doing this too, to harness the human microbiome. And we're looking at control and patient groups. For instance, we have a study that I'll tell you about in a minute that's in cognitively impaired patients, where we collect stool samples from patients who have cognitive impairment when they're elderly, people they live with, and then from children who are healthy, non-obese, don't have illnesses, haven't taken antibiotics between the ages of 4 and 7. And we look at differences in the different metabolic byproducts they make, and what the cognitively impaired people, what do they have in their bodies, and what could we possibly use as a drug? And then we can study these things in animals first, and then we take the things that seem to work in animals to humans, and that may involve fecal microbiome transplant, that may involve probiotic administration to change things like cognition, depression, anxiety, or it may involve giving things like postbiotics. And so this is a trial where we're actually analyzing the data. We've actually collected all the samples for it. And this is, again, that study I told you about, the NIH funded, where we're taking fecal samples from children who are otherwise healthy, from cognitively impaired people, the MCI people there in orange, and then from cognitively normal people who are elderly and live with the cognitively impaired people. Because again, your microbiome is made up by environment. So are there things that in the same environment are different in the guts of people with cognitive impairment that are not different in the people they live with? And those things, we're looking at metabolomics, so we're looking at the metabolites, and we're looking at the bacteria. We're seeing big changes actually already, I will tell you. I'll hint at some of the data. We're getting ready to write the paper. And those are things that may be drug targets to help reduce Alzheimer's disease or reduce cognitive impairment. And then maybe there's things that kids have that are unique that could be ways we could restore a healthy childlike mind to elderly people. And then we study those things in mice. So in conclusion, illness in the Western diet leads to significant loss of diversity. Antibiotics do this too. Stress does this as well. We need to correct this and maintain a healthy gut, because a healthy gut is a diverse gut. And if we have a healthy gut, we'll have a happy mind, because a happy gut is a happy mind. And again, it's not all in your head. I would advocate to you that health and happiness start in your gut, and that the day is coming where we can change your health and your happiness by prescribing things, by resodding the lawn, and giving you back the 100 trillion friends that you didn't know you had, but that you definitely need. And in the process of doing that, restore the balance we need. And now with the science being so progressed, we can make it so easy a child can do it. And so in the end, I want to thank Rob Knight and his group that helped us do a lot of research. A lot of the slides and data that I have provided to you today come from the John Cryan Lab in Cork. He is one of the renowned world leaders in the gut-brain connection. I encourage you to look up his papers and look up his lab. He's really one of the world leaders, and a lot of the data you saw today came from him. Any of you that are, again, interested in learning more about nutrition and the microbiome, we have a clinical nutrition fellowship that covers this extensively, where we teach classes. It starts every January. There's about 25 modules, and then you have a lecture you hear, and you get to interact with very famous worldwide faculty. The students come from all over the world. They're physicians, dietitians, pharmacists, PAs, medical folks from around the world. That we have 13 countries represented, 4 continents, that come together to learn nutrition from the experts and learn nutrition from each other. We have 2 Zoom meetings a week where we interact with them, and they talk about how they care for the challenges they face nutritionally in the microbiome world in Indonesia or in Australia or in Colombia or in Panama or in Africa. And so it's a really great opportunity. We actually have a clinical research training program that we're focused on the nutrition and the microbiome as well, that we teach courses specific to this, that we're starting this year in the fall. And then we actually have research track fellowships where if you're a medical person who want to do research, you can actually get funding to do that, and we'll help you mentor you through that process. And the last thing I'll advocate to you is a lot of this data you saw from healthy subjects came from the American Gut Project. And so I think Rob Knight's still doing this. And basically, this is a program where you send Rob your stool, and this is Daniel McDonald who does a lot of the analysis, and he will send you back your microbiome at any given time, and a big analysis of what that is. And it costs a little money, but he has raised almost $1 million or millions of dollars now to fund microbiome science by doing this. And you can actually sponsor a child in Africa's stool to be analyzed. You can sponsor your wife's to be analyzed, or your dogs. You can send any of these things in, but we need more samples because that's how we learn what normal and abnormal are. And it's great that Rob's lab is, when they're in Colorado and out there in San Diego, they bring kids in to show them how robots analyze their poop. Unfortunately, kids don't always think that's so awesome, but not everybody wants to know what's in their poop, but we definitely do. And I hope you think you should too. And with that, I'll thank you guys for listening. I think there's lots of chances we can all give to improve our minds and our bodies this way. I encourage you to follow me on Instagram and on Twitter and on YouTube. My lectures are there, and I share lots of new data and lots of new information about the gut, about the microbiome, about probiotics, and about nutritional health and health in general. And so with that, I have a few minutes. I can take a few of your questions, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. And the last thing I'll say is, if you want these slides, I'm happy to send you the entire slide deck as a PDF. So feel free to email me with questions, to get papers I may have mentioned, or in particular to get these slides if you would like them. And that's my email. Feel free to reach out anytime. Thank you.
Once again, Dr. Wischmeyer, you did not disappoint. I feel like that was just a lot to process, but thank you so much for sharing all of that really important information that I don't think is really out there, right? And so this is just one way of kind of putting that information out there. If you do have a question for Dr. Wischmeyer, he has just a few minutes. He's got a very busy schedule. He's going to have to go soon, but you can put your question in the comments for Dr. Wischmeyer. Graham, I wanted you to bring you up here as well. What were your initial comments, or did any questions come up with that onslaught of information?
Yeah, a lot of information there. Just it's just amazing how such a two-way highway between the brain and the gut can have such an impact between both organs, right? And lectures like these, because I've been involved with them, I know it's an uphill battle sometimes with prescribers to show them the evidence with this, but it is really amazing how physicians really can listen to these and change their mind when it comes to the impact that the microbiome has, even starting with Dragon's site, aeprobio.com. So hopefully something like this is really, for some physicians out there, brought some information to light.
Yeah, I was also curious, you mentioned the use of probiotics in hospital. Is that something that is becoming more standardized, or are we very far from that still? Because it looks like, from what you're presenting, that the evidence is quite clear on the benefit for it. Where are we at with that at the moment?
I mean, I think it's hugely variable from hospital to hospital. I will tell you, at Duke, we definitely have probiotics in our formulary. We have lactobacillus, like I've mentioned in the lectures before. We use lactobacillus GG. If you want to get that at home, it's the cultural product. And again, I'll disclose they have supported our research in using lactobacillus GG to prevent COVID, which we were successful in reducing COVID infections with that. We think that's a really high quality probiotic because we really like the manufacturing process. We got an IND from the FDA for it. And so that's one of the reasons we also have it on formulary at Duke, because it's one of the probiotics we really trust and our patients can get at the store. So our hospital does have a number of probiotics, including that one, and that's one of the ones I use. But many hospitals, when I was at University of Colorado in the past, before I was at Duke, we didn't, and we couldn't get our P&T committees to approve them. They felt like there wasn't good enough quality control, or there wasn't enough data, or these weren't FDA regulated. But I do think, like you said, the data is really becoming quite compelling and quite large in scale, such that, like we talked about last time, we have a paper in Nature showing reduced viral infections and respiratory infections in thousands of patients, published in perhaps the premier journal in the world, showing the benefit of a lactobacillus probiotic. So I don't think we can deny there isn't clinical evidence. And I think, like you saw, there was a large body of evidence for probiotics use in depression, and why I'm not hearing more mainstream use of what is really a simple, benign, very physiologically sound intervention for depression isn't being used more often. I don't hear that more often post, PTSD, anxiety, and then of course all the consequence diseases like IBS and other things that come as a result of that. I don't very often hear them being intervened on by probiotics when they seem like they'd be the obvious intervention to try first. Not to say that there isn't a clear place for the other antidepressants. I would never say that. I think the role of sort of modern pharmaceutical medicine is also critical. But again, why is it when you start someone, say, on Lexapro or Zoloft or Paxil, would you not also be giving a probiotic along with that? Because it's nobody's goal to be on these drugs, these antidepressants, the rest of our lives. And I feel like we're not treating the actual cause potentially of the depressive illness by giving back some serotonin inhibition or dopamine from a different drug. Whereas if you change the very generation of those substrates in the gut by restoring a normal gut microbiome, the theory would be, right, you could cure or prevent the recurrence and ongoing nature of the deficiencies perhaps in serotonin or the changes in the gut-brain axis that led to the depression and anxiety in the first place. So to me, it seems like, yes, we have to use our modern drugs and our modern pharmacology to treat depressive illnesses and anxiety and all those things. But then why are we not at the same time giving a probiotic or changing the diet or giving other things that will actually get what that likely is part of the root cause and the ultimate long-term prevention or cure in some ways, if it can be maintained, for what's driving the depression, the anxiety, or other cognitive or psychological challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wonder if some healthcare providers might see that as more of like they don't see it necessarily as an adjunct to the treatment, right? But rather a replacement, and that's not what you're talking about at all, right? And so maybe that's where maybe some of the confusion might lie, and hopefully with lectures like this, we'll slowly, educate and be able to change that message somewhat. I have a question here from Theodore. Any link between microbiome and the effects of general anesthetics in terms of POCD, delirium, et cetera? For those of you who don't know, Dr. Wischmeyer is an anesthesiologist. So it's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. And as I mentioned, you heard me mention briefly that we have a study that we now have all the samples collected. We've analyzed all the samples for looking at really a similar question to that, where in these cardiac surgery patients, and of course, these are circulatory arrested patients having aortic surgery. So there's also the effect of the circulatory arrest in the bypass circuit. But anesthesia itself, as we know, we believe it has some cognitive effects for sure, especially in elderly folks. That's kind of part of what we're beginning to get at in this study. We also have a project at Duke called the 1,000 Patient Microbiome Project, where in 15 different surgical common surgeries, we're collecting microbiome and other omic samples, genomic, metabolomic, inflammatory markers, and then outcomes on 15 different kinds of people having different kinds of surgery, almost all of whom are being exposed to anesthetics, obviously. And we're going to begin to analyze that data before and after the anesthetic exposure, along with, of course, the surgery itself, but to see, are there changes, and can we go back and look at different kinds of anesthetics that are used that might be changing the microbiome that ultimately will change cognition, post-op cognitive dysfunction, those other things. But to get to your question more acutely, we definitely are about to publish and get finished up on the data looking at the effects of cardiac surgery and the cardiac anesthesia that goes with that on cognition. And we have both oral and fecal samples that go from pre-op all the way to a year later, along with really extensive cognitive delirium and psychologic testing that goes all the way through that span. And so we have really robust analysis of their cognition and of their other issues that we're going to be able to tie to the effects of surgery and to some degree, hopefully, anesthesia in that data. And I can tell you, we've already begun to, I can hint, we're already seeing some changes that I think we know that the oral microbiome in itself and the nasal microbiome seems to have historically a lot of effect on the brain and the development of cognitive function. And so I think we're beginning to see hints that it may do that in patients as well, that perhaps the microbiome they come into surgery with or the microbiome they leave surgery with or after anesthesia, both may have effects sort of on their development of cognitive disorders. And that's a great question. I think it opens up a world of research. And Mara Serbanescu, who's this brilliant mentee I've been honored to work with from Hopkins, who now is at Duke, is now able to do her own microbiome analysis. She's the one analyzing all this data. And so she's like able to do the things that computer scientists can do statistically, but she's also a card-carrying anesthesiologist and ICU doctor and researcher who we're just super excited about. We think she's truly unique in her field and is going to begin to answer some of those questions. She actually has data in mice looking at isoflurane, which is one of the anesthetics we commonly use in patients. And it does have effects on the microbiome in mice. And I guess the next step, right, is then to look at cognition. So that's a brilliant question.
And a brilliant answer. So thank you very much for that. So much appreciation for your presentation today. People are really appreciative for this information. And I don't want to keep you any longer, Dr. Wischmeyer, because I know you have a meeting and you've got all kinds of things going on. So I'm going to get right to our book giveaway. Brenda Marsh, you are the winner of our Gut Logic and Healthy Logic books today. So if you can, please email me at friendlypharmacy5@gmail.com. Graham will send those books to you swiftly. I know he does it quite quickly. You just have to send me an email with your address and we'll get those to you. Thank you, Graham, so much for being here. I know that was a fire hose again of information, but it's great to always have you with us. Any final comments?
I can't wait to see the study printed that he's referring to there. It seems like there's so much information there. So look forward to that. Thank you again for coming here a second time. This is a lot of information in 2 visits.
Awesome. No, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. And stay tuned. We'll have our closing session of the Gut Logic series coming to you in about 10 days. So watch for that in our community tab. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Dr. Wischmeyer and Graham as well. And I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful week. Thank you. Take care and stay healthy.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks.